The human spirit, created for contemplation of eternal truths, finds itself today besieged by an unprecedented assault on its natural capacity for sustained attention. What we witness in this digital age is not merely distraction, it is the systematic dismantling of the very faculty by which we apprehend reality at its deepest levels. The constant notifications, the endless scrolling, the fragmenting of thought into bite-sized pieces, these are symptoms of a profound disorder in the soul's relationship with truth. Yet within the ancient wisdom of contemplative discipline lies the remedy. The same principles that guided medieval scholars through manuscripts by candlelight can restore your capacity for deep, sustained intellectual work. Through decades of forming minds at the École Pratique de Hautes Études, I have witnessed the transformation that occurs when souls embrace the disciplined pursuit of truth over the chaotic consumption of information. The methods I have refined are not antiquated curiosities, but timeless keys to unlocking the mind's highest powers. Today, we reclaim the sacred territory of focused attention from the merchants of distraction. The battle for your intellectual soul begins with understanding what you have truly lost, and what can be restored through disciplined practice rooted in contemplative tradition. This is not merely about productivity or efficiency, but about the fundamental dignity of human consciousness and its natural orientation toward the divine. Chapter 1: The Anthropology of Attention: What Digital Culture Destroys in the Human Soul. The capacity for sustained attention is not merely a cognitive skill, it is a fundamental expression of human dignity. When Thomas Aquinas wrote of the mind's natural orientation toward truth, he understood that this orientation requires what we might call attentional integrity, the ability to hold reality steady before the intellectual gaze long enough for genuine understanding to emerge. Modern neuroscience confirms what contemplative tradition has always known: the human brain possesses remarkable plasticity, reshaping itself according to the patterns of thought we habitually practice. Digital culture systematically trains the mind in patterns of fragmentation. Each notification interrupts not just your current thought, but the deeper process by which sustained reflection builds toward insight. The average knowledge worker checks email every 6 minutes, but the cost extends far beyond lost productivity. Each interruption fragments consciousness itself, creating what I call attentional anxiety, a state where the mind becomes addicted to stimulation and loses its capacity for the patient waiting that true contemplation requires. This is not mere inconvenience, it is spiritual tragedy. The human person achieves fullness through the integration of experience into wisdom, but this integration demands uninterrupted periods of reflection. When we surrender our attention to the rhythm of machines rather than the natural rhythm of thought, we literally reshape our souls according to mechanical patterns. The result is a generation of minds capable of rapid information processing but incapable of the slow digestion by which information becomes wisdom. The contemplative tradition offers a different anthropology, the human person as naturally oriented toward sustained communion with truth. This requires what medieval authors called custody of the eyes, not merely visual discipline, but the broader custody of attention itself. In my years of formation work, I have observed that students who maintain this custody develop what I term intellectual sovereignty, the ability to direct consciousness toward worthy objects rather than being perpetually reactive to environmental stimuli. The spiritual dimension cannot be overlooked. Attention, in its deepest sense, is a form of prayer, the offering of consciousness to reality as it truly is, rather than as we wish it to be. When digital devices train us in patterns of perpetual distraction, they undermine not only our intellectual capacity but our spiritual receptivity. The soul that cannot attend cannot truly receive the gifts that reality offers. To reclaim this capacity, we must first understand what we have lost and why its restoration is essential to human flourishing in its fullest sense. Chapter 2: The Physiology of Deep Work: How Contemplative Practice Rewires the Mind. The human brain exhibits what neuroscientists call experience-dependent plasticity. Its physical structure adapts to the patterns of thought we practice. This biological reality validates what contemplative masters discovered through centuries of careful observation. Sustained practice of focused attention literally transforms the mind's capacity for concentration. The disciplined cultivation of attention is not merely psychological exercise, it is the conscious participation in our own neurological formation. When you engage in the deep work of sustained study, several remarkable changes occur in brain function. The default mode network, that collection of brain regions active during rest and mind wandering, becomes increasingly regulated. The anterior cingulate cortex, responsible for conflict monitoring and error detection, strengthens its capacity to maintain focus despite distracting stimuli. Most significantly, the prefrontal cortex develops enhanced executive control, allowing for what I call attentional sovereignty, the ability to choose where consciousness focuses rather than being victim to environmental stimuli. Contemplative reading, properly practiced, engages what researchers now term slow-wave activity, the brain state associated with deep learning and memory consolidation. This is why the medieval practice of lectio divina proves so effective. It deliberately cultivates the precise mental conditions necessary for information to transition from temporary storage to integrated understanding. The slow, repeated reading with pauses for reflection creates optimal conditions for neural encoding and retrieval. However, these benefits require consistent practice over extended periods. The brain adapts to whatever patterns we repeatedly engage. Digital distraction creates neural pathways optimized for rapid task switching but poorly suited for sustained attention. Each time you check your phone mid-thought, you strengthen neural circuits that make sustained focus more difficult. Conversely, each period of uninterrupted concentration strengthens the neural architecture of deep attention. The contemplative tradition understood this principle long before neuroscience provided the vocabulary. The monastic emphasis on stability, perseverance, and regular practice reflects an intuitive grasp of how consciousness shapes itself through repetition. What we now call neuroplasticity, the ancients knew as the formation of virtue through habit. In my experience training scholars, those who commit to regular periods of sustained, undistracted work develop what becomes almost a different quality of mind, more peaceful, more penetrating, more capable of the patient waiting that allows truth to emerge. Reversing the damage of digital fragmentation requires deliberate counter-training through contemplative practices that gradually rebuild the mind's capacity for extended focus. This is not mere habit formation, it is conscious participation in the renewal of your own intellectual faculties. The brain that has been trained in scattered attention can be retrained in contemplative focus, but this requires both understanding of what you are attempting and the patience to allow natural rhythms of growth to unfold. Chapter 3: The Architecture of Sacred Study, Creating Contemplative Space in Digital Chaos. The physical environment profoundly shapes consciousness, yet contemporary culture systematically undermines the conditions necessary for deep intellectual work. The contemplative tradition understands that sacred study requires sacred space, not merely physical arrangements, but carefully ordered conditions that support the soul's natural movement toward truth. Creating such space in our digital age becomes an act of resistance against the forces of fragmentation. Begin with the principle of environmental integrity. Your study space must reflect the dignity of the work undertaken there. This means eliminating all digital distractions, not merely muting notifications, but physically removing devices that fragment attention. The smartphone, that pocket-sized generator of anxiety, has no place in the sanctuary of contemplative study. I have observed that students who create device-free study spaces report not only improved concentration but a qualitatively different experience of intellectual work, more peaceful, more penetrating, more conducive to genuine insight. Create instead what I call a monastic cell for intellectual work, a designated space containing only those materials essential to your current study, arranged with the reverence due to instruments of truth-seeking. Books should be arranged not for mere convenience but in recognition of their dignity as vessels of wisdom. Writing materials should be of good quality, chosen for their contribution to the contemplative atmosphere rather than mere functionality. Even details like desk height, chair comfort, and their quality affect the soul's capacity for sustained attention. The temporal architecture proves equally crucial. Digital culture operates on the rhythm of immediate gratification, but contemplative study requires what medieval authors called seasons of the soul, extended periods structured according to natural rhythms rather than artificial urgencies. Establish fixed periods for deep work, protected from interruption like the canonical hours that structure monastic life. Begin with shorter periods, perhaps 40 minutes, and gradually extend as your capacity strengthens. Lighting affects consciousness more profoundly than we typically recognize. The harsh blue light of screens stimulates cortisol production and inhibits the calm alertness necessary for sustained reflection. Natural light, supplemented when necessary by warm artificial illumination, creates optimal conditions for the quiet intensity that characterizes genuine study. I recommend facing a window when possible, allowing the natural rhythm of daylight to support the natural rhythm of thought. Even the materials matter. Paper books engage different neural pathways than digital texts, promoting the kind of spatial memory that aids deep comprehension. The physical weight of a book, the texture of paper, the visual stability of printed text, these seemingly minor details contribute to the contemplative atmosphere necessary for serious intellectual work. Most importantly, establish clear boundaries between digital engagement and contemplative work. The mind cannot instantaneously transition between modes of consciousness. Allow transition periods, perhaps 10 minutes of silence, before beginning serious study, creating space for attention to settle into its natural depth. This transition time is not wasted but essential preparation for the quality of attention that serious study demands. Chapter 4: The Discipline of Single Tasking, Recovering the Lost Art of Intellectual Focus. Modern culture has canonized multitasking as a virtue, but cognitive science reveals it as a fundamental misunderstanding of how consciousness operates. The human mind cannot actually attend to multiple complex tasks simultaneously. What we call multitasking is rapid task switching that fragments attention and degrades performance on all activities attempted. The contemplative tradition has always recognized this truth. Genuine intellectual work requires what I call unified attention, the complete focusing of mental faculties on a single object of study. The myth of productive multitasking causes immense spiritual damage. Each attempt to divide attention creates what researchers term switching costs, the time and mental energy required to refocus after interruption. But the deeper cost is existential. Fragmented attention produces fragmented consciousness, preventing the integration of experience that constitutes wisdom. When we attempt to read while monitoring email, to write while fielding phone calls, we train the mind in patterns of superficiality that eventually become permanent features of our intellectual character. The psychological research confirms what contemplatives have always known: task switching reduces overall productivity by as much as 40% while simultaneously increasing errors and stress. More troubling still, the constant switching between tasks prevents the mind from entering the state of flow, where optimal learning and creative work occur. This state requires sustained, uninterrupted attention to a single object, precisely what our digital culture systematically undermines. Single tasking, properly understood, is not mere productivity technique but spiritual practice. It represents the decision to give yourself completely to the present moment's legitimate demands rather than scattering consciousness across multiple competing claims. This requires what contemplatives call custody of intention, the disciplined choice to resist the anxiety that drives constant activity in favor of the patient focus that enables genuine accomplishment. Begin practicing single tasking with reading. Choose a substantial text, philosophical, theological, literary, and commit to reading for 30 minutes without any other activity. No note-taking initially, no checking references, simply the pure encounter between mind and text. Notice how quickly the impulse arises to do something else, to check something, to multitask. This impulse reveals the degree to which digital culture has colonized consciousness itself. The resistance you feel to sustained single-tasking is not merely psychological but spiritual. The fragmented mind has lost touch with its natural capacity for depth and must be gradually retrained through patient practice. In my years of formation work, I have observed that students who commit to regular single-tasking practice develop not only improved concentration but what I call intellectual courage, the willingness to stay with difficult problems long enough for understanding to emerge. Gradually extend this practice to writing, research, and other intellectual activities. Each task receives your complete attention for its designated period. This may initially feel inefficient to minds trained in digital urgency, but the quality of work produced through sustained focus far exceeds anything achieved through fragmented attention. Moreover, single-tasking paradoxically increases overall productivity by eliminating the hidden costs of constant task switching while enabling the deep work where genuine insights emerge. Chapter 5: The Practice of Contemplative Reading, Ancient Wisdom for Information Overload. In an age drowning in information, the ability to read contemplatively becomes essential for intellectual survival. The medieval practice of lectio divina, literally, divine reading, offers a time-tested method for transforming mere information consumption into genuine understanding. This practice, refined through centuries of monastic wisdom, provides the perfect antidote to the superficial skimming that digital culture encourages. Through careful application of these principles, any text, sacred or secular, can become a vehicle for genuine intellectual formation. Contemplative reading proceeds through distinct phases, each serving a specific function in the transformation of knowledge into wisdom. The first movement, lectio, involves slow, careful reading with complete attention to the text's actual content. This is not speed reading or information extraction, but patient encounter with the author's thought. Read each sentence completely before proceeding to the next, allowing the meaning to settle into consciousness rather than rushing toward conclusions. The goal is not coverage but penetration, to understand deeply rather than broadly. This phase requires what I call intellectual humility, the recognition that worthy texts deserve our complete attention and cannot be mastered through hasty consumption. Choose books that challenge your current understanding rather than merely confirming existing beliefs. The contemplative reader approaches each text as a potential teacher, willing to be changed by the encounter rather than merely seeking to extract useful information. The second movement, meditatio, involves sustained reflection on what you have read. Here you engage in what I call intellectual rumination, the slow digestion of ideas through repeated consideration from different angles. Ask not just, "What does this mean?" but "How does this connect with other truths I know? What implications follow from this insight? How does this challenge or confirm my existing understanding?" This phase requires silence and patience, allowing understanding to emerge organically rather than forcing premature synthesis. Medieval scholars understood that true learning requires time for ideas to settle in consciousness. Just as physical digestion requires time to transform food into nourishment, intellectual digestion requires time to transform information into wisdom. During meditatio, you are not merely thinking about the text but allowing it to think through you, permitting the ideas to work themselves out in your consciousness until they become part of your intellectual framework. The third movement, oratio, might seem irrelevant to secular study, but it represents something essential, the recognition that truth ultimately transcends our individual comprehension. Whether through formal prayer or simply through humble acknowledgement of mystery, this phase prevents the intellectual pride that treats truth as possession rather than gift. It maintains the proper relationship between the student and the reality being studied, a relationship of receptivity rather than domination. The final movement, contemplatio, involves simply resting in the truth encountered, allowing it to shape consciousness rather than immediately seeking to deploy it for some practical purpose. This is perhaps the most countercultural aspect of contemplative reading in our utilitarian age, the willingness to let truth exist for its own sake, to be changed by encounter with reality rather than constantly seeking to manipulate reality for our purposes. This phase often involves what contemplatives call learned ignorance, the recognition that true understanding deepens our appreciation of mystery rather than eliminating it. Chapter 6: The Rhythm of Restoration, Balancing Digital Engagement with Contemplative Retreat. Complete withdrawal from digital technology is neither possible nor necessary for most contemporary intellectuals, but the integration of digital tools with contemplative practice requires careful discernment and disciplined rhythm. The key lies not in absolute avoidance but in conscious alternation between periods of digital engagement and contemplative retreat. This creates what I call technological Sabbath, regular intervals where consciousness can recover its natural depth and integration. The principle of rhythmic engagement recognizes that human consciousness operates according to natural cycles that digital culture systematically violates. Just as the body requires periods of rest between exertion, the mind requires periods of contemplative quiet between intense digital stimulation. Without these intervals of restoration, consciousness becomes increasingly fragmented and agitated, losing its capacity for the patient receptivity that genuine learning requires. Establish clear temporal boundaries for digital engagement. Rather than allowing technology to colonize every moment of existence, designate specific periods for email, social media, and other digital activities. Treat these as bounded activities with definite beginning and end points, not as continuous background radiation throughout your day. Many find success with a practice I recommend, checking digital communications only twice daily, at predetermined times, rather than maintaining constant connectivity. This creates what contemplatives call custody of the hours, the disciplined organization of time according to authentic priorities rather than external demands. The psychological research on attention restoration theory confirms what contemplative tradition has always known: certain environments and activities naturally restore the mind's capacity for sustained focus. Natural settings, contemplative reading, walking meditation, and periods of genuine silence all contribute to what researchers term directed attention restoration. These activities are not leisure but essential maintenance of the cognitive resources necessary for serious intellectual work. Between periods of digital engagement, create spaces of genuine silence. Not merely the absence of digital noise, but positive cultivation of interior quiet through practices like contemplative reading, walking meditation, or simply sitting in silence. These intervals allow consciousness to settle into its natural rhythm, processing and integrating the day's experiences rather than constantly consuming new stimuli. I have observed that students who maintain regular periods of silence develop what I call interior spaciousness, a quality of attention that remains calm and focused even amid external distractions. The practice of digital fasting proves particularly valuable, 1 day per week completely free from digital engagement except for genuine emergencies. This weekly Sabbath creates space for the kinds of reflection and integration that constant connectivity prevents. Use this time for extended reading, contemplative prayer, meaningful conversation, or simply the luxury of sustained thought without interruption. The resistance you may feel to this practice reveals the depth of digital addiction in contemporary consciousness. Pay careful attention to the transition between digital and contemplative activities. The mind cannot instantly shift between radically different modes of attention. Create buffer periods, perhaps 5 to 10 minutes of silence, before beginning serious study after digital engagement. This allows the agitation produced by rapid information processing to settle, creating optimal conditions for deeper intellectual work. Most importantly, evaluate digital tools according to their service to genuine intellectual goals rather than their capacity for entertainment or distraction. Email serves communication, research databases serve scholarship, social media typically serves neither. Make conscious choices about which digital tools genuinely support your intellectual vocation and eliminate those that merely feed the addiction to stimulation. This requires what contemplatives call discretion, the ability to distinguish between what appears useful and what actually serves authentic human flourishing. Chapter 7: The Formation of Attentional Virtue, Building Contemplative Habits for Lasting Focus. Sustained attention is not merely a skill to be learned but a virtue to be cultivated, a stable disposition of the soul that enables consistent excellence in intellectual work. Like all virtues, attentional integrity develops through repeated practice of specific acts until they become natural expressions of character. The formation of this virtue requires understanding both the psychological dynamics involved and the spiritual significance of the transformation you undertake. The classical understanding of virtue as second nature applies perfectly to the development of contemplative attention. Through consistent practice of focused engagement with reality, the soul gradually develops what becomes a natural inclination toward depth rather than distraction. This is not mere habit formation but the cultivation of excellence in what is most essentially human, the capacity for sustained communion with truth. Begin with what I call micro-practices of attention, brief periods of sustained focus that gradually build the mental muscles necessary for extended concentration. Start with 5 minutes of focused breathing, simply attending to the natural rhythm of inhalation and exhalation without attempting to control or modify it. This basic exercise in sustained attention provides the foundation for all more complex contemplative practices. The simplicity is deceptive. Maintaining attention on breath for even 5 minutes reveals the degree to which the untrained mind habitually wanders. Progress to sustained reading of challenging texts. Choose books that require genuine intellectual effort, philosophical works, theological treatises, substantial literary texts, and commit to reading for gradually increasing periods without distraction. Begin with 15 minutes and slowly extend to an hour or more as your capacity develops. The key is consistency rather than duration. Daily practice of shorter periods proves more effective than sporadic attempts at extended focus. The contemplative tradition emphasizes what we might call graduated practice, beginning with simpler forms of attention and gradually progressing to more complex ones. Just as physical training requires gradual increase in intensity, attentional training requires patience with natural rhythms of development. Pushing too hard too quickly leads to discouragement and abandonment of practice. Proceeding too slowly fails to challenge the mind's developing capacity. Develop the practice of contemplative writing, extended periods of thinking on paper without the pressure of immediate productivity. Set aside time for what medieval authors called spiritual exercises, written reflection on important questions without concern for audience or publication. This practice develops the capacity for sustained thought while creating valuable space for integration and synthesis. Many discover that their best insights emerge during these periods of unpressured reflection. The practice of what I call attention inventory proves invaluable for developing self-awareness about your current capacity and gradual improvement. Each week, honestly assess your ability to sustain focus, noting improvements and identifying persistent challenges. This is not self-criticism but careful observation that enables informed adjustment of practice. Like a gardener who observes the gradual growth of plants, you learn to recognize the subtle signs of developing attentional capacity. Track your progress through what I call an attention journal, brief daily notes about your capacity for focus, the challenges you encounter, and the gradual improvements you observe. This practice maintains awareness of your developing capacity while providing encouragement during inevitable periods of difficulty. The journal also reveals patterns, times of day when focus comes more easily, environmental factors that support or hinder concentration, the relationship between physical health and mental clarity. Most importantly, understand this formation as participation in your own spiritual development. The cultivation of sustained attention is not merely instrumental to other goals but intrinsically valuable as an expression of human dignity. Through disciplined practice of contemplative attention, you become more fully yourself, more capable of the patient receptivity to truth that constitutes the essence of intellectual virtue. This formation affects not only your capacity for academic work but your ability to be present to others, to appreciate beauty, to participate in the contemplative dimension of existence that defines human flourishing at its deepest level. Conclusion. The battle for your intellectual soul is not merely personal struggle but participation in a larger cultural restoration. Each moment of sustained attention you cultivate, each digital distraction you resist, each period of contemplative focus you maintain contributes to the renewal of contemplative culture in our fragmented age. The practices I have shared are not mere techniques but spiritual disciplines that form the whole person for the patient pursuit of truth. Remember that this transformation requires time and grace. The habits of distraction developed over years cannot be overcome in weeks, but consistent practice of contemplative discipline gradually restores the mind's natural capacity for sustained attention. Begin where you are, with whatever capacity you currently possess, and trust in the slow work of formation that respects the natural rhythm of human development. Your intellectual life is a sacred vocation, a participation in humanity's eternal conversation with truth. The digital chaos surrounding us need not define the quality of your interior life. Through disciplined practice of contemplative attention, you can reclaim the heritage of focused, sustained intellectual work that has always characterized genuine scholarship. This is not nostalgia for a simpler past but the recovery of timeless principles that remain as relevant today as they were in the medieval monastery or the ancient academy. The contemplative path offers no quick fixes or technological solutions, but it provides something far more valuable, the gradual transformation of consciousness itself. As you develop the capacity for sustained attention, you will discover that you are becoming not merely more productive but more fully human, more capable of wonder, more receptive to beauty, more patient with mystery, more present to the sacred dimension of existence that reveals itself only to consciousness that has learned to wait and to watch. May your efforts in this restoration serve not only your own formation but the renewal of contemplative wisdom in our distracted age. The world needs minds capable of sustained reflection, souls formed in patient attention to reality. This is your calling and your gift to future generations who will inherit either a culture of distraction or a renewed tradition of contemplative excellence.